Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
We're not far from Memorial Day weekend, the traditional kickoff to the summer travel season. That means lots of folks across the United States have plans to head into the national park system. And there's been a lot of work across the park system, not just to prepare for this summer, but to catch up with some long overdue maintenance in the parks. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. We're taking time with today's podcast to take a look out across the national park system and at the National Park Service to explore how things are on the ground, literally and figuratively. To help me with this discussion, I've invited Kristen Brengel, Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the National Parks Conservation Association, and Phil Francis, the immediate past chair of the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks, to discuss recent events. We'll be back with them in a minute.
Since 1986, national park visitors have turned to the best-selling guidebook Passport to Your National Parks to collect fun ink stamps from each of their explorations. Just take your passport book to any national park visitor center or park store and get your free ink stamp with the date and location of your visit. Personalize your passport even more by adding stickers, logging your favorite hiking trails, and mapping your next adventure. You can also show off your love for our national parks with passport-themed apparel and accessories. Best of all, 100% of proceeds from the Passport program support your national parks. Stamp your passport as you capture stories, preserve memories, and discover America's natural and historical treasures. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix the depth of experience in the parks and land space with the breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com. Potrero group.com. Interior Federal Credit Union is pleased to offer members up to $500 in closing costs with a new home equity line of credit. Now is a great time to apply for a rate of 3.25% APR before they jump up. Take advantage of low rates and a great deal at interiorfcu.org. Membership is required, equal housing lender.
Okay, we're back with Kristen Brengel from the National Parks Conservation Association and Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. Thanks for joining me today, guys.
Glad to be here.
You know, there really has been a lot in the news recently about the national parks and the national park system. And I guess I'd like to start off with the new deferred maintenance number that the Park Service came out with recently. Roughly, and very roughly, it went from roughly 12.8 or 13 billion from the last time the Trump administration mentioned it back in 2019, and at the time they said it wasn't really worth discussing it on an annual basis anymore. And now the Biden administration says it's closing in on $22 billion. Part of that increase is a new methodology of calculating the maintenance backlog, and I guess they're taking into account some administrative costs that you would have thought would have been in there in the past, contracting costs, different studies and whatnot. What should we make out of this new deferred maintenance figure?
Well, I was reading a program about it before we began today, and I see that instead of using work orders that have been the basis for the backlog in the past, where they accumulate all these work orders that the park superintendents send in and regional offices or Denver service centers send in to come up with the total amount of backlog. They're using parametric equations now, which I guess is an industry standard for determining the amount of backlog or maintenance that is needed based upon the total value of the assets owned by the National Park System. And so I don't understand it all yet, but it's not surprising really that when you look at the value of all the assets, that this number has gone up. Whether or not they're accurate, I don't know. We'll find out. But I guess one of the questions that I have and one of the concerns that I have is can we adequately, the National Park Service, explain that to the Congress in such a way that is persuasive and that it has a lot of credibility?
Kristen, what have you heard about it?
Well, Phil hit the nail on the head that I was actually at a House Natural Resources Committee hearing in the early 2000s when Fran Manella was director of the Park Service. And I remember Congress asking her, how much do we have, what are the costs of fixing the parks right now? We know there's all this damage. And I remember her walking around Capitol Hill with binders full of work orders. And she would put them on the hearing table and say, this is what I'm getting back from the superintendents. And then we knew that they were taking these work orders and putting them into a database. And that's how they were arriving at this number year to year. Did that include costs of design and planning? Well, for the transportation side, because it's handled by the Department of Transportation and the Park Service, we believe that they were doing that for the transportation side, but we don't know that they were doing it for the other park maintenance issues. And so it's not really a shocker here that those costs weren't fully added to the cost of the projects. So the fact that they're updating the number and adding all of the costs associated with the projects, that's to be expected. We also know from working on these issues.
Wait a minute. Why is it not a shocker that they didn't include those costs? I mean, when I, as a homeowner, get ready to do some home maintenance or some landscaping, I mean, I just can't factor in the labor or just the materials. I mean, I've got to, pony up the money for the costs and whatnot and of the project and factor that into my overall bill.
It's because of the way they handled it, is that this was a work order. It was an internal document, and the park superintendents were sending them to the regional office and the DC office and saying, I need to fix a road. Here's my estimate of what it costs right now. And they were putting it into a system. They hadn't been told, you're going to get this funding, and then told to do all the planning and all the other things around it. It was just a collection of projects that they knew damage was accruing on. So it didn't have all of these costs associated with them. And so this wasn't done in sort of this, at least the impression that I always had, in this like systematic way that incorporated everything in it. It was a snapshot of what needed to be fixed. And so, I mean, Phil would know more as a superintendent than I would, but when we started the campaign on the Great American Outdoors Act, Pew at the time did a huge FOIA request and asked for all of the work orders. And then they hired a former Park Service person to put them in a database that you can actually still look at on Pew's website. And that database is just a database of all the work orders. And we don't know if the work orders were ever updated. So if you had a work order in during the Bush era, when Fran Manella was walking around with her binders, it's possible that those costs were never updated. And so personally, it doesn't surprise me if those things weren't updated and we don't have actual 2022 costs of these things. If in fact this new system that the Park Service has is an update and it's accounting for inflation and all these other costs, that's a really good thing for everyone, and to make sure that we know the actual costs of this. But I'm not surprised if some of this is old data and some of it is just a project description with an estimate.
Phil,
And
inconsistently
done.
Yeah, you were a superintendent for a long time, longest at Blue Ridge Parkway. But somebody told me that the Forest Service had always been including those other costs into their calculations. Any idea why the Park Service didn't?
Every park was a little different. Every manager was a little different. Some facility programs and parks had large staffs, professional people who could do estimates on NEPA compliance and all the other things that have to be done in the planning and design and the engineering. Other park staffs are not as well equipped, and so they're as maintenance funding declined and the number of people declined, there wasn't a lot of time to spend on this aspect of the maintenance program. They wanted to fix the parks and keep them clean and repair them. And so it wasn't a priority. It was my experience moving from park to park to park, and no two parks were really in the same place. And there's a lot of paperwork involved in this program. And so how do you, with limited staff that is always getting smaller, how are you going to keep it up to date? And so I think that this new program, it would be easier for that to occur because it's based upon a parametric equation. You know, if they can keep the estimate of the value of the assets up to date by some measure and some means, that means that the deferred maintenance program would also be updated. That's my interpretation of what I read this morning.
Well, does this mean that the Park Service in Washington is going to do a better job of seeing that all the parks stay on top of these numbers?
You know, it's going to be very hard because the size of the regional offices is half of what they used to be, and there's fewer of them. The number of people working in the Washington office has greatly declined as well. We have been focused on getting adequate funds to restaff the parks to fill vacant positions. But the Congress has always been reluctant to fund central offices. So I think it's going to be difficult to do that. I was talking yesterday with some folks about the state of the affairs in the National Park Service. There's different aspects, and we need to look holistically at what needs to be done for the National Park Service to be an effective, competent organization. We tend to focus on, well, we've lost 23% of our rangers, or we've lost 40% of our maintenance people, but we really don't talk about the lack of training, the lack of housing, you know, how long it takes to fill positions. We don't look at every aspect in trying to describe adequately what needs to be done. And then once we do that as well as possible, you know, the allocations to the various committees is funding wise is not sufficient to provide for all the needs.
Kristen, what does this new number mean in the big picture? And by that I mean everybody was excited about the Great American Outdoors Act, and we were going to cut the deferred maintenance backlog in half in 5 years. And now you look at this new figure, $21.8 billion of deferred maintenance, and you look at $1.3 billion a year flowing into it from the Great American Outdoors Act, and there's just 4 years left to that funding. I mean, this seems incredible.
It does. And, you know, it's when we worked with Senator Warner and Senator Portman on the original bill, the Restore Our Parks bill, actually, it was the Parks Legacy Act, I think, when they introduced it in 2017. That bill actually said, we will pay for the entire Park Service maintenance backlog. I don't even think it had a number on it. And so that bill was introduced first in 2017. And then Senator Alexander, Senator King, others got involved, and a negotiation ensued. And that's when the Restore Our Parks bill emerged. And it was decided with the Trump administration at the time that they were only willing to do $6.5 billion. And so there was a desire originally to take care of the entire maintenance backlog when that first bill was introduced, but there was a negotiation that occurred and they capped it at 6.5 for the Park Service at the time. And we went with it because we felt that it was far better to try to get rid of some of the maintenance backlog and the highest priority projects than nothing. And if you remember at the time, we were going up to Capitol Hill telling stories about the water pipe bursting at the Grand Canyon, roads at the Blue Ridge Parkway and other places that were completely eroding off the side of hills, the Yellowstone Loop Road and all the problems with the roadbed, sewage plants. There was a lot of empathy during that period of time among Congress to do something. to take care of parks, but we knew from the number that was selected that it was A, not going to fix everything, and B, not keep up with the cost of the problem growing over time. And so we knew it was just going to take a chunk out of the maintenance projects that were the most problematic throughout the park system, where we had to look at where people were going to have a miserable experience in a park if they didn't have potable water or drivable roads. And so we always knew it was just taking a chunk out of it, Kurt. We knew it wasn't A, fixing the problem in total, and B, keeping up with the cost of the problem getting bigger over time. So we have to reconcile a fact here. The Park Service has the second most assets of any federal agency. The Department of Defense is the only agency above the Park Service that has more assets. So if we as a country believe that the parks are super important and that we want to continue to take care of them, and they provide us, our lungs and fresh air and our history, and we want to continue to protect and preserve all of that, then we have to say the 75,000 assets of these places need to be fixed. And that's buildings, roads, big things that need to be fixed. And we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone. These places are old. Their infrastructure is old. We have to just commit to fixing them long term. And if it's reauthorizing the Great American Outdoors Act, which NPCA is going to push for, that's one of the solutions. I talked with Senator King's staff a couple nights ago. They want to bump up appropriations significantly. This is a commitment that we need to make, and we need everyone's help in doing so. And the other arm is philanthropy. There are a lot of industries that benefit from parks: airlines, railroads, hotels, lodging. If everyone helped a little bit here, if Congress did what they needed to do, if the philanthropic community could help more, we can solve this problem. It's highly solvable. It's just the Great American Outdoors Act wasn't a panacea. It wasn't going to fix everything. And if we had stuck to Mr. Warner and Mr. Portman's original idea, maybe we would have gotten there, but we didn't. It was a negotiation. And so now we have to figure out what the next few years are going to look like. But I think the Park Service has done a great job in the last few years of repairing places. They've made very key investments. And I think as we see visitors going into parks this summer and in the next few summers, they're actually going to see improvements that have taken place there. And hopefully it will invigorate folks to want to continue to repair the other places. And so we had to start somewhere.
Okay, I want to follow up with that in a minute. We're going to take a short break now. We'll be right back.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That is why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people, inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the National Park System for decades to come. See their successes at gtnpf.org. The Everglades Foundation, the only organization whose sole mission is to restore and protect America's Everglades. Learn more at evergladesfoundation.org. The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org.
We're back with Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks, and Kristen Brengel, Senior Vice President for the National Parks Conservation Association. Kristen and Phil, I mean, this new number, I mean, it's mind-boggling in that, you know, the last number we heard was around 13 billion, and then all of a sudden, 3 years later, it's $22 billion. Is there going to be political pushback from Congress? Are they going to say, boy, we can't trust you guys to come up with an accurate number of what you need, so why should we give you more money?
That's how this all started many years ago. The Congress said to the Park Service, when they asked for more money to do maintenance, says, well, prove it. Let's see the list of projects and how much it costs. And are you using facility management maintenance programs in your parks? And so the National Park Service began a process of doing just that. And, you know, I think it's going to be hard to explain. And there will certainly be people who are going to push back on that number. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But inflation is occurring right now at a pretty amazing rate. And so these numbers are going to get bigger.
Kristen, it must make your job tougher, going up onto the Hill and explaining to Congress why they need to support this kind of number.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard when you put a number out there and then you change it. And it's not it doesn't appear to be incremental. So there's always difficulty in explaining it to folks, but everything needs to be repaired. You can't have sewage systems and water systems and roads and bridges and expect that they're going to last forever. Everything has a life cycle attached to it. And, you know, pipes burst, roads crumble. It is a part of life. And if you own a house, you know that, you know, the roof has a life cycle. You have to replace it after a few years. You can't just patch it up. And so we just have to, you know, remember as we look at these numbers that stuff breaks all the time. And the big stuff breaks too. And because when the parks were established, we put housing in them and visitor centers and maintenance shops and all sorts of things. And in some cases, there are villages in parks, towns, basically. Those things need to be repaired. And I think it's amazing when you think about the Park Service and the staff and how much they've been able to keep everything moving along and keep smiles on their faces over the course of time that they did. But, you know, I know we talked about this a lot, Kurt, when we talked about the Great American Outdoors Act, but Mission 66 was a long time ago, before I was born, okay? And I'm a middle-aged woman. That was a long time ago, and expecting things to still be functional that were repaired in, you know, the 1950s, it's not fair. And so, yes, the Park Service will probably get criticized for not having their numbers in better shape, but we're not talking about a corporation here either that has access to new flashy systems. We're talking about the federal government, and they don't always have access to, like Phil was saying earlier, certain trained people and certain databases and materials that a corporation would have access to. And I think in 2022, we are so used to our iPads and our computers, and we just think everything is accessible and easy. And the fact of the matter is the Park Service has 20,000 staff. It's decentralized. Everyone's doing the best that they can. And the systems are just not as great as the private sector. And so we have to help get it to be great and make sure we're spending the tax dollars to get it there. But this may be just eye-opening for the public to learn that everything is not perfect in our bureaucracy. And we could sit around and poke at people and blame folks, but the fact of the matter is go talk to a park superintendent and ask them about the systems they have and their ability to do things. And they'll be honest with you about what their limitations are. And so I would say, let's not criticize our friends at the Park Service and try to help them get the money they need to be better at their jobs.
You know, you mentioned park philanthropy, and the National Park Foundation has been doing an incredible job in recent years. They've been raising a lot of money for the parks. I noticed that at the end of fiscal 2019, they had over $271 million in assets, in net assets. And I know they don't spend $271 million a year. That's not a rational approach to things. But I understand a lot of their funds are actually in restricted funds. The money comes in and it's not unrestricted dollars that they can spend anywhere that the need exists. And I've been trying to understand their restricted funds program, and I haven't been able to get through to that yet. But I'm just wondering if those philanthropic dollars that go into the park foundation, how much might be for unrestricted uses across the park system, and how much would be, well, I really love Yellowstone and I want my dollars to go to Yellowstone projects, or David Rubenstein, I really love the National Mall in the Arlington House, and I want my money to go there. Any idea on the restricted funds at the Park Foundation in terms of that $271 million and how much is restricted to X number of parks?
I don't know, but I do know that as any nonprofit, they always want unrestricted funds. Right. But the donors often have certain interests, as you just described, and they're going to donate money to those things that they want their money to go to. So I think it's an educational process, but I think it's going to be hard to get a lot of unrestricted dollars. Having worked with, the nonprofits in Yosemite and Smokies and the Blue Ridge Parkway, and now being part of a nonprofit raising dollars, trying to find those unrestricted dollars are pretty hard.
Kristen?
I'm not familiar with the National Park Foundation budget, but we did work with them on the Centennial Challenge bill back in 2016. And if you remember, that bill is based on specific projects, so essentially restricted funding. But the idea here was to leverage a dollar match. For every federal dollar, there would be a philanthropic dollar. And I think the National Park Foundation and the Friends groups have done a great job of maximizing that match money and leveraging it for really great projects, whether it's carriage roads in Acadia or the walkways in Yosemite at Mariposa Grove. There have been some really excellent projects where they've been able to leverage, that one-to-one match. And so while it may be not great that the funding community prefers restricted money, we are getting some great projects done in specific parks that are focused on a particular project. But that's what people like to do, Kurt. They like to know exactly where their money is going, and they like to be able to see the progress. And I think if I were in the National Park Foundation's shoes, I would say, let's get the projects done if that's what people want to do. And, but I don't know their budget well enough to know, where they stand in terms of restricted and unrestricted.
Sure. And you just mentioned, Yellowstone or Yosemite and Acadia. And what about Minidoka National Historic Site? What about Fort Laramie? What about all those small parks that really could use some financial support? And, to your point about the matching funds that Congress provided the National Park Foundation, you're well aware, I'm sure, and Phil's probably well aware that legislation just recently was introduced to boost that $5 million a year to, I believe, $15 million a year. And the Park Foundation has done a great job in seeking matching funds for that money. And, hopefully the rest of Congress will get behind that legislation and pass it as soon as possible so, we can start seeing the fruits of that come to fruition on the ground.
Kurt, it's really important to say, and I know NPF has pointed this out, but the National Fish and Wildlife Association has tons of money. And Interior just announced yet another program where they're distributing funds for the America the Beautiful campaign. And I think it's to the tune of like $80 million. I sat on a call with them. And there's a desire to make sure that NPF becomes what NIFWF is right now and becomes that hub for the Park Service in some ways of those philanthropic dollars. And so not every philanthropic arm of an agency has as much money as others. And so this is something that we want to build up over time. And I think the bill that just got introduced to increase the money for NPF is just the start in some of that.
Okay, here's a head scratcher question for both of you. NIFWF, that's the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Kristen, is that the formal name?
Something along those lines.
Something along those. My point being, national parks, America's best ideas, national fish and wildlife refuges, nice places, but they don't quite stand up to the national park system. Why does NIFWF have so much money and the National Park Foundation? I mean, the National Park Foundation is doing pretty good, but not as good as NIFWF. Any idea why the disparity?
I think it has to do with how money is collected from the hunting and fishing community.
Yeah. And to that point, there was we wrote about this some months ago, a proposal from Resources for the Future, I believe. Margaret Wall speculated on how much money could be raised if there was an excise tax placed on backpacking gear, tent gear, whatnot. Dedicate that for the National Park Service. Is that got any chance of gaining attention in Congress? Such a proposal?
It's been attempted before, you always have to retest whether people have an appetite for that. And I think in the 90s it was squashed, but now that outdoor recreation has become, such a big part of people's lives now, especially in this COVID world, that maybe folks would be open to it. Whereas it was maybe more of a niche industry, but now it's just sort of like you can get the fanciest boots. It took me 3 hours to buy my backpack because there were so many features that, I was like, oh, well, if I could get a bottle holder here and I could grab it, I want that feature. And so, I mean, it's definitely taken off as an industry now. And so maybe we could start that conversation again. But I think in the 90s, folks just didn't have an appetite for it. So,
Phil, any idea if this new deferred maintenance figure is going to put more pressure on the friends groups? I mean, the old saying was that the friends groups provided that margin of excellence, and now we're seeing more and more friends group campaigns to provide some of the bone structure for the National Park Service, whether it's the Yosemite Conservancy raising $20 million for the Mariposa Grove restoration, or the Grand Teton National Park Foundation raising $17 million or so for the Jenny Lake restoration, and now they're investing millions in the Snake River access plans. I know the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation has done incredible jobs raising money for Flat Top Manor, for the Bluffs Restaurant. Are we going to see more pressure on these groups to raise money for the stuff that the Congress should be funding?
Yes. I think so. I think it's clear that it will be, but I think those groups have some limits as to how much money they can actually raise. I remember being in a meeting with a very wealthy person who has hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, and he said to the group, he said, there's only so much I'm going to donate to the federal government because I already pay a ton of taxes as it is. And so I think there will be more pressure. And how much more money that the French groups can raise, I'm not sure. But you're right. I think already there are programs that are being funded by nonprofits that are programs that would not have been able to be funded by nonprofits in the past because of policy considerations. And so I know that the Park Service has looked at, in fact, using fee money, for example, or donated funds to hire permanent employees or to fund permanent type programs. I think there's real danger in that. But I think Park Service their hands are tied. They have been placed in an untenable position where they're having to do things that they would have considered not acceptable in the past. They've been very creative. They've gotten a lot done with what they have, and I think they should be applauded for it.
I think that's well said. I agree with Phil.
Are we going to see a greater disparity between the haves and have-nots in the park system?
Absolutely. That's always been a problem with the park system. And we need to figure out the equity issue constantly. And I have brought it up continuously with the Biden administration. In fact, I actually think they're very tired of hearing me say it. I think they're sick of me saying it, but we need to look at all of the parks. We need to make sure they're all taken care of. And I think from our standpoint, when we look at some of the new park units that are coming on, we're trying to figure out and help stand up some friends groups. And I think it's going to start to become a real effort here at NPCA to make sure if we can help a group of people who care deeply about a park unit, help them get a nonprofit started to accumulate some philanthropic money. Like sort of one of the things we're doing with Amachi is helping the community in Colorado figure out how to develop a philanthropic arm that's robust there. So it's, there's more we can definitely do, but equity is a huge issue.
Yeah, I saw Eastern National, of course, helped bootstrap a nonprofit friends group for the Outer Banks in North Carolina, those National Seashores in Fort Raleigh and the Wright brothers. And I believe once upon a time, the National Park Foundation set up what is now the Alliance in Florida for the Florida National Parks. So, there are different organizations working to try and address this problem. Definitely needs to be more. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. I'm talking with Kristen Brengo from the National Parks Conservation Association and Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks about the fiscal fitness of the National Park Service and the ramifications of it.
Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokiesinformation.org. We are park stewards to ensure our most wild and historic places remain for generations to come, to safeguard our preferred arena for adventure, reflection, and inspiration. We donate 4% of our proceeds, that's revenues not profits, to support America's most wild and historic places. We are Wild Tribute, apparel for the parks. Find out more at wildtribute.com. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
Phil, Kristen, you both mentioned the struggles of the National Park Service, the staffing situation, the cutbacks in the regional offices. Does the agency have the necessary staff across the regions to manage the deferred maintenance program?
Only
I
they
would
need
guess.
staff for. There's so many things they need staff for. I just want to say that deferred maintenance is just one category, Kurt. So I just want to make sure, like, we have museum collections that haven't been cataloged. We have interpreters that are desperately needed in parks. We have so many things that need money for staffing. I just want to point that out before Phil goes.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, there's huge deficits in staffing in the agency, and it's much more than Great America's Outdoor Act. It's dealing with thousands and thousands of new visitors and damage to park resources and changes in behavior, adding new parks, dealing with exterior issues, superintendents, oil and gas drilling next to your park, oil, uranium mining next to, there's so many things going on, and the staff has just been depleted. And with the lack of housing and the changes in personnel and how long it takes to fill positions, there's a serious challenge, for the National Park Service managers to really have a first-rate organization. I really feel for them. They're in a really tough spot.
On Tuesday, May 17th, National Parks Traveler is going to have a webinar presentation with John Jarvis, the former director of the National Park Service under the Obama administration, and his brother Destry Jarvis, who has a long conservation career. Kristen, he worked for National Parks Conservation Association, and then he worked for the Clinton administration in the Interior Department. And they've got a new book out that kind of looks back across their combined 5 decades, or each one of them 5 decades, working either for the National Park Service or around the National Park Service or involved with the National Park Service. And towards the end of the book, they make an argument that it's time for the National Park Service to be pulled out of the Interior Department because there's too much politics involved, wagging the dog, as it were, for the National Park Service. I'm sure it's going to be a provocative conversation I have with the two gentlemen. What do you think about that proposal?
I haven't read their book. I haven't gotten my copy yet, although I'm looking forward to reading it. And, John was a political appointee, remember? So he was a political appointee during the Obama administration. And so the fact of the matter is, the way our government functions is that we run via a cabinet in the White House, and those cabinet members have to go through Senate confirmation process. And it's one of the checks on our government. And so even if the Park Service were pulled out and made its own entity, I don't see how it would function outside of the political process. And if you need money, federal taxpayer dollars, you have to go to Congress to ask for that money. So politics are very much a part of any agency. It doesn't matter. There's no agency that's immune to politics if you're getting taxpayer dollars. So it's just the sort of reality of the American system of government. And so I don't know how you create sort of such an independent arm of the federal government that it would be immune to it.
Well, I think they're talking, looking at the Smithsonian Institution as the model. You have a board of directors that appoints the CEO, as it were, of the Smithsonian.
Yeah, but that board of directors is made up of who? Former politicians, in some ways.
Isn't it a step removed from every 4 years you've got possibly a new administration in charge that has a different philosophy? I mean, we went from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration, and the pendulum has swung back and forth.
I know, it's painful, and it's part of our process, but it wastes incredible amounts of time as well. So not only does it philosophically change on you, but you also, look how long we waited for Chuck Sams to be put in place as director of the Park Service. It's painful. When John Jarvis was being considered in front of the Senate, I think from his hearing to his vote, it took 8 or 9 months. That's painful to have someone just waiting on the sidelines to do their job. But it's a good philosophical debate to have. I'm not saying don't have that debate philosophically and talk about the benefits and the pluses and minuses of our democracy. But every agency goes through it. And I think we have to ask ourselves as a democracy, how can the superintendents and the staff at the Park Service as career employees improve transparency and public information in a way that it makes it harder for a political influence to come in and derail smart ideas. And I say this to Park Service staff all the time. It is 2022. Put the information on your website. tweet it, put it on your Facebook account, notify the public, get the information out there. Don't hide memos or information. Put it out for public consumption, so it makes it very hard for anyone to come in and mess with a good decision. But if you use science, if you adhere to law and public policy, and you show your work, you show your homework, you put it out there for public consumption, it makes it easier for a watchdog like NPCA to buttress your decision with Congress and try to make it bulletproof. But if you don't put that information out there, if you don't tell people what you're doing, it is much harder for those of us who are trying to help the Park Service every day to help them. And so there are many things that could never be done decades before that can be done now that can help insulate Park Service staff from political whims. And I mean, this is a challenge to Park Service staff. If you have science that proves protection of an animal, protection of people, get it on your website. Make it publicly available, but we have to get the institution to also create checks and balances so that they're not subject to political winds that are traveling around. And I think when I look back at working on things like the Yellowstone winter use issue, there was nowhere to hide. Those environmental assessments were always put online, and everyone could look at them and see that the noise impacts weren't being reduced, could see that wildlife were still going to be pushed around if there weren't guided tours. It's a good thing to put this stuff out there, and we shouldn't have to just wait for a NEPA process to do it. That stuff should be available all the time so that we can have the checks and balances sit with those who deeply care about the parks and not the politicians. And so anyway, I'm going through this on many issues right now, and I just kind of feel like I think there are so many ways that career staff can build in more protection for their decisions if they didn't wait for a NEPA process or some other formal process. I remember even during the Bush administration, some really smart superintendents would write these determinations on issues and publish them. And just say things like, jet skis don't comport with the quality of the experience we want to have at this park unit, so we're not going to allow them. And you know what? Even Gail Norton, the Interior Secretary at the time, couldn't argue with it because they put it out there. And so I don't understand why there isn't more proactivity in terms of getting this information out there. I think it would help a lot.
Phil, what do you think? I mean, during your career, could you have gotten away with that?
Some of the time I could have. Other times, maybe not. I think there was a lot of fear instilled during the last administration, about speaking out. They couldn't even say the word science. But I remember some scientist, I think in California, was called to Washington to the secretary's office and reminded what he could or could not say. I've been called by the secretary's office in the past for answering a reporter's question about whether or not we had adequate funds in a park, and said that I was lobbying the Congress and that was illegal, and that I needed to cease and desist if I wanted to keep my job. And then there's been other things that have occurred structurally in the organization that made it really hard to do what Kristen said. I absolutely agree with everything she said. Those are really great ideas. But, if you've got to send it up to the secretary to get it approved before you can put it out to the public, that makes it a bigger challenge. Of course, you can leak it, I guess, but it is difficult. Now, in the past, I've heard, well, we need to keep the National Park Service as part of the interior because it provides a layer of protection that if you had a separate independent agency, there would be more immediate and easy exposure to political whims. I look forward to hearing what they've got to say. this is an old argument, and I look forward to hear. And how do you change? This is an important decision because, the political climate is going to change eventually, and it's going to be different. And then will this be a decision that fits well in the future? And so I don't know. If I were king for a day and I had to decide, I'm not sure what I would do at this point. That would be a very, very difficult decision.
Transparency is very hard to achieve these days. I know the Obama administration said it was going to be very transparent, and I think it fell short. Certainly, the Trump administration fell short with transparency, and I'm seeing it again with the Biden administration. Kristen, you raised some good points and some wonderful principles. The fact of the matter is, most of the questions I and the freelancers who work for the National Parks Traveler pose to the Park Service, the individual parks, have to go to Washington before that park can speak to us. That's not transparency. There are those superintendents who have put in 3 decades or 3.5 decades, or the chief ranger who's ready to retire, and they're saying, what are they going to do? Fire me? That's fine. I don't care, But, transparency is an issue that gets controlled by the administration in power. And we've seen that. And, I don't know if a freestanding Park Service would be more transparent or not. I mean, it just, it's hard to see that far. But certainly, Tuesday's conversation with the Jarvises is going to be very, very interesting and provocative, and I really look forward to it. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. It's been a great conversation. I'd like to continue it, and I'm sure we will continue it. And I appreciate your thoughts and inputs. And any parting shots?
I enjoyed it, and thanks for doing this again. I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, and Congress is right now doing appropriations work. And so for everyone who's listening, this is a good time to weigh in with your member and, call them up, write them. There are plenty of talking points on both NPCA and the coalition's websites. And, please advocate for more staff and more money for the parks to fix things, improve interpretation, anything that you care about. This is a great time to call over to Congress and put in a good word for parks and getting them the resources that they need. So, and if you need help, just reach out to NPCA. We're happy to help you. But it's an important time. This is the time of year where everyone's doling out the money. So you got to be a squeaky wheel.
Yeah, it's really a bipartisan issue. I mean, visitors support both sides of the aisle. So, yeah, I think that's a great idea, Kristen. Yeah.
Okay, that's Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks, and Kristen Brengel, Senior Vice President for the National Parks Conservation Association. Thanks to you both for your thoughts today, and look forward to see what happens in the weeks and months ahead.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. As a reminder, Tuesday night, the 17th of May, National Parks Traveler will be holding a webinar with Jonathan Jarvis, former director of the National Park Service under the Obama administration, and his brother, Destry, a long-time conservation champion, worked for the National Parks Conservation Association, as well as in the Clinton administration Interior Department. The topic will be a new book that they've got coming out, National Parks Forever, and in it, they recommend that the National Park Service be pulled out of the Interior Department and made a freestanding agency. To find out how you can attend the webinar, go to nationalparkstraveler.org. If you can't make the webinar, next Sunday we'll be running the conversation as a podcast. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit nationalparkstraveler.org.